Welcome back, everybody. We're starting a new section and we're going to really start to dive deep now into the components that make up infrastructure as a service. We did cover storage in the last section, and that is going to be the basis for everything in infrastructure as a service. But now we're really going to start working around the architectural components within infrastructure as a service, and that's going to be Azure networking. So in this particular video set, we're going to cover the networking overview, what all of the services are that are available inside of Azure, and we'll start by going into virtual networks, talk about the components of virtual networks, which are subnets, gateways, and a great new feature called network peering. We're then going to talk about how to control user traffic and balance user traffic using things like load balancers and application gateways, as well as traffic manager. Then we'll start to dive into some really deep topics around networking, such as NIC cards and addressing. We'll talk about securing the network traffic. We'll talk about domain services. And then at the very end, we'll talk about how to monitor and manage all of your network resources, as well as how to script them, just like we've talked about scripting at the end of every other section. Now, within this particular section, we're going to just do a networking overview, talk about very high level what all of the services are and what all of the ones are that you might want to actually use within your architecture. So we'll talk about some of the networking concepts and design, and we'll talk about some networking resource overview. So with respect to networking in Azure, we're going to talk about connectivity to start with, and that's where the virtual network comes into place, because it is then going to provide you connectivity to the Azure network, which is what you're going to need in order to be able to talk to storage, as well as potentially many other services down the road as your architecture grows. But in most architectural cases, you'll also need some internet connectivity, and we'll talk about how that is possible. And that's going to be through things like public IPs. Some customers like to have hybrid connectivity because of some of their applications, especially if they have high privacy or security needs. So we'll talk about on-premise connectivity through VPN gateways. We'll then talk about load balancing and traffic direction, where we can use things like load balancers, web application firewalls, or traffic manager, network security, firewalls, and how they actually get deployed within Azure. And then just like any other networking topic, we have to focus on routing and whether or not you want to use the out-of-the-box routing that Azure provides for you, or whether you want to force specific routes based on particular traffic flows. And then, of course, manageability and monitoring. I just want to show you some quick diagrams of some common networking architectures that customers put into place. And I'm not going to dive deep into this, but what you can see here is the internet's at the top. The Azure Load Balancer service is then the very first hop for this particular architecture. But on-premise also has connectivity through what's called an express route circuit. And of course, I'll dive into these in a little bit more detail in a little bit. Once we hit the Azure firewall and Azure load balancers, we're now into a virtual network. And then that virtual network is actually split across multiple subnets, with each one of them having access control, what Azure calls network security groups. And all of these things can be connected from an authentication perspective using Azure Active Directory. And I know I've mentioned that with respect to almost every Azure service. And then, of course, inside of the subnets are specific VMs with disk and processors and memory and so on. Another common focus is, of course, the on-premise network. I'm working with a couple of customers right now where that is extremely, extremely important. And in that instance, they are going to leverage what's called a VPN connection between their data centers or on-premise network and the virtual network that gets deployed inside of Azure. And using things like user-defined routing, you can actually force flows back and forth between on-prem and Azure whenever you need to, just depending upon your particular application requirements. And there are absolutely use cases. But of course, you're going to need keep in mind the physicality of that network traffic flowing across distances. Another common network diagram, or a different version of a network diagram, and this one pointing out the route tables and the specific network security groups, or NSGs, which you can think of as firewalls, allowing or preventing access into each of these specific subnets. You'll also notice that there's an item in here called a virtual network appliance, and I'll talk about those. These are provided by third parties that can, in some cases, provide features that Azure right now does not provide that some customers absolutely need. So, for example, the out-of-the-box Azure load balancer is a strict layer 4 load balancer. It does route traffic to multiple endpoints that load balancer is configured with, but it really doesn't do much else other than that. If you need to do things like packet sniffing or doing routing of particular traffic that once it hits that particular load balancer, then you're going to need what's called a level 7 or layer 7 load balancer. Maybe you need to do things like cookie affinity. And for layer 7 load balancers, Azure has one called the Azure Application Gateway, but some customers bring in their own because they already have licenses for a Barracuda or an F5. And those particular companies have provided their load balancers as virtual appliances that can be purchased and leveraged inside of the Azure Marketplace. And I believe I showed that in the first section when we were talking about the Marketplace. Let's now head on over to the portal and let's actually go into a little bit of detail about what all of the specific services are within Azure. So I'll see you when we get over there. So you notice I went back to azure.microsoft.com first, and I'll go to the portal in a second, but I just wanted to point out if we go under products here and then click on the networking tab, it does give you a list of every one of the available services that you can instantiate or create inside of Azure. And I'll go into each one of these very briefly, and then we'll dive into them in a lot more depth in other videos within this section. So let me go ahead on over into the portal. Okay, so starting with the navigation, I want to just dive into each one of these specific networking areas. And this is a quick and easy way to see what all of the networking specific resources are. So I'm going to scroll down here to networking. Now let's talk about each one of these. Virtual networks, whether it's the classic or the new, is where you're going to actually isolate virtual machines as well as other services inside of Azure and make them yours. In other words, they are not necessarily going to be internet accessible or public. You absolutely can have the control over keeping them internal within this virtual network and isolated from the rest of the world. And if you need to therefore keep them really completely isolated and only allow users from your on-premise network, you're going to be able to do that, and the virtual network is going to be that connection point. That virtual network is going to be a IP range that you're going to be able to define, and then you're going to be able to carve that virtual network up into subnets. And then each one of those subnets having its own specific IP range, and then of course you can put virtual machines or load balancers within those subnets. And that was some of those diagrams we're showing you in the slide deck. The next item is the load balancer. Now the load balancer, of course, is going to provide you some high availability around a specific set of VMs that are performing the same service. So for example, a cluster of database servers or a cluster of web servers that all are performing the same action, same application on the same port, and you need to be able to get them based off of traffic requirements. The application gateway, which I mentioned a little while ago, is our layer 7 load balancer, and it provides a lot more features beyond just doing traffic flow, traffic analysis, and of course routing the traffic based on the availability. It can provide things like cookie affinity, among some of the other features that I mentioned before. The next item on here is virtual network gateway, and as well as local network gateway, and I'll talk about both of those together. The virtual network and local network gateways are the items that you're going to create in order to provide network connectivity from your on-premise network. And that is going to be done via VPN. Now, that VPN can be done over the internet using either a site-to-site network or a point-to-site network. And of course, I'll dive into these in more depth in a future video. But they will provide that VPN. Now, it is going to be a secure tunnel using IPsec, IPsec, but it will provide that VPN connectivity. Now, there are plenty of customers, including the ones that I'm working with right now, who need something more secure than that. I'm going to skip down here to an item called ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute are VPN connections between on-premise and virtual networks as well. However, they are leveraging dedicated circuits. So therefore, that traffic is not flowing over the internet using a standard IPsec VPN tunnel. In fact, it's actually flowing from a dedicated circuit that the customer has bought and paid for, and then connects into their virtual network directly. The next item is DNS zones. So you can actually leverage DNS as a service within Azure. Now, by default, that DNS service is a public service, but we have just announced the availability for private DNS zones, meaning that your DNS service would be specific to your virtual network and be very similar to as if you had deployed a DNS service within your virtual network and managed it yourself. This gives you having Microsoft manage that service for you. Now, I mentioned earlier about being able to control the routing of traffic. That's where route tables comes in, and that's specified as being user-defined routing. And that gives the customer the ability to say, hey, look, when a application request is coming into a load balancer, meaning it's going to hit a specific web application, let's trap that traffic first, sniff it, make sure that it's not going to actually do something malicious within the network, and then we'll send it over. Therefore, we're going to send it to a virtual appliance that can do that packet sniffing and then route it back to the load balancer or to the web servers after, in fact, it has done that packet sniffing. That's just an example of how our route table can be leveraged. Now, CDN is something I'm not going to be talking about in this video series. I really consider it as something that falls outside of networking, but Azure and Microsoft feel that it does fall under networking. But CDN is a content delivery network. It's a service that you can put on top of static content that needs to be available in a really performant fashion. And rather than you building out a global network that can make that content available across that global network, thereby replicating it to a number of different endpoints, you can leverage Azure's content delivery network. And what we'll do is say, okay, you specify a set of content that you want to have replicated, and then we already have that geographic network in place. We'll replicate the content out for you, but then you have to design your application to say that you want the content delivery network URLs to be used when a customer requests a web page for that static content. That's kind of the idea. And there's Azure-defined content delivery networks, and there's also Akamai-defined content delivery network, as they are a major partner of Microsoft. The next item is Traffic Manager. And Traffic Manager you can think of as geographic load balancing. Now, it's not quite to the same level of depth that the Azure load balancers are, because it is at a domain name and not an IP address endpoint. But what it is a routing mechanism at the geographic layer where you have the same application sitting in multiple regions. And you want to make sure that the user goes to the region that they are in fact closest to. So let's say that they are in Europe, but you have regions in East US, West US, and then maybe Asia. Well, then depending upon where they are in Europe, if they are on the far west side of Europe, they're probably going to go to East US. But if they are going to be maybe a little bit closer to maybe Czechoslovakia or Russia, they might actually go to the Singapore region or the Japan region, just depending upon what that distance happens to be. Also keeping in mind that they would be going over land rather than sea. So that is something that Traffic Manager can help provide. It can also provide a disaster recovery profile where it keeps an eye on two different regions and says this one's the primary, the second one is the secondary. If the primary ever goes down, it immediately routes all traffic over to secondary, where the secondary is maybe a warm site just waiting to be kicked in. The next few items are really, really deep items and are usually attached to other resources, but I do at least want to touch on them. Once again, I'm going to go into them in more detail. The Network Watcher is going to be part of the manageability and monitoring side, and it was something that I pointed out to you When we were talking about Azure Monitor back in the very first section of videos, Network Watcher is a fairly new feature, but it gives you a bunch of different things that you can do to keep an eye on your network, the traffic within your network. You can do some validation and troubleshooting of pieces of your network, validating that the traffic is flowing the way that you want it to. It's going from hop to hop the way that you're expecting, or that the firewalls are in fact allowing or preventing data that you expect, things like that. And we'll go into that in the monitoring section. Network security groups you can think of as firewalls, and they are almost identical to firewalls in that you are defining a set of rules that have priorities, that have a source IP, a target IP, and then a port number for each, thereby allowing you to specify allow or deny from and to specific IP addresses within your virtual network. And then those firewall rules can be applied to either an entire subnet or a specific NIC card, which then leads me to the next item, which is network interfaces. Network interfaces, you can think of as just a standard NIC card that you would put into a piece of hardware, but they are tied, of course, to a virtual machine. Those NIC cards, of course, you can have one-to-many on virtual machines. It depends upon the virtual machine and what it supports. But those network interfaces are then what you're going to attach either a private IP address coming out of your virtual network subnet or a public IP address, which is the next item on the list, where you can actually get a static public IP address that Microsoft will provide to you that, of course, you can then put into your DNS, and that will be the public endpoint for any internet-facing application that you're going to be deploying inside of Azure. There is also a reserved IP, and you'll notice there's a few different items that have the word classic on here, and that's for supportability of our old resource management framework, which I think I mentioned in the first set of videos. In this set of videos, all of these different series, we are not going to be talking about classic at all. They are only around for customers who are still using them and have been using them for a long period of time and just have not migrated yet. So those are all of the services that are available inside of networking. Let's now head over to the deck again. We'll talk about what's coming in the next video, and we'll start to dive deep into virtual networks.